Hi there, BookTube. It's Roz, and in this video I'm going to kind of reflect on two books, Aurora Leigh and Jane Eyre, both written by Victorian women writers. And I'm going to start by a little bit of context. So Victorian literature is almost like the first great age of the woman writer. Not that there weren't women writers before, of course there were, but they really burgeoned during the Victorian period. If you think, particularly in fiction, if you think of the big names of Victorian fiction, it's really in English, it's really the first period when those big hitters include a really kind of strong representation of women writers, and that's both in terms of literary kind of opinion and sales, what were the big sellers of the period. And of course Victorian women writers, like women writers of every period, write about anything and everything, whatever they are interested in, whatever they think is going to sell, and that's great. But I think it's kind of almost inevitable that as women writers, they bring something of their experience as Victorian women to their books. And, inevitably, they do explore women's issues a bit more, or from a different perspective than male writers would. They're bringing their reality, and it comes into their work, even if they're not women that have been sort of particularly motivated to write specifically about that. And I think these are two books that really kind of illustrate that for me. I'm not going to call that writing about women's issues as feminist, because for me, I think that's kind of transposing onto the Victorian period kind of ideas, definitions that belong in a later age. I also think if we look to Victorian women writers to kind of uphold the kind of views and values about gender equality or whatever that we'd expect today, in a way we're setting ourselves up for disappointment, and it's kind of unfair to them. That's their context was different. That doesn't mean to say that they weren't addressing big issues in a really interesting way. Hannah of Hannah's Books made a video about a week ago about the tenant of Wildfell Hall, where she sort of looks at some of this too. So I will copy that below. But I think, what we do see in Victorian women writers is those kind of seeds of change, even if we don't call it feminist. There are moments in Victorian literature when a woman character asserts a right to autonomy or self-determination or kind of choices and self-respect, in a way that really, shifts the ground and resonates for me as a woman reader today. And I'd say that these two books, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte and Aurora Leigh by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, are two where you really see and feel that there are characters that really bring that out. And I want to talk about them together for a few reasons. One is they're both books that I love. Another is because they're both from the mid-Victorian period. Charlotte Bronte and Elizabeth Barrett Browning were mid-Victorian women. So before that sort of burgeoning of ideas that we call the New Woman movement and so on. So they precede that. Jane Eyre came out in 1847 and Aurora Leigh in 1856. So say right in the middle of the 19th century. And also, there are really close parallels between these two books in terms of plot lines and aspects of the characters, and aspects of the sort of ideas that flow through the books. Jane Eyre, we have to acknowledge, is one of the most read and loved Victorian novels, and including it was read by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who wrote Aurora Leigh, and in fact we know that she guessed that Currer was actually a woman before Charlotte Bronte's identity was revealed. And we know that she was read more than one of Charlotte Bronte's books, but including read Jane Eyre when it was relatively newly out. She was living in Italy and she couldn't get a copy at first, and then she did. So we don't know, I don't think, that Charlotte Bronte read Aurora Leigh because of timing. Yeah. Whereas Jane Eyre is one of the most read Victorian novels by a woman, Aurora Leigh is not, and much less so. It's critically well respected, but it's not so commonly read, and that's not surprising because it's a novel in verse. It's an epic poem of a sort, novel, and that's less immediately appealing, particularly perhaps to a modern reader. It's not something that we're sort of so tuned into, I suppose. Plus, there's more use of poetic language. That it perhaps might feel a bit less accessible. There's more. There is a strong plot. There are really kind of well-developed characters, but it kind of goes off in sort of reflection and almost like philosophizing at times in a way that Bronte doesn't in Jane Eyre. So it's understandable that it's less read, but I would say it is more accessible than that. What I've just said might sound. It's enormously interesting as a book, and often very beautiful, particularly in terms of the language. So, similarities between the books. Well, both feature a main character that's female. That's Jane and Aurora. They're both written in the first person, and so we get that kind of intense connection with the main character, with Jane and Aurora's sort of inner life. And both books start in childhood and carry through until the main character is like an adult woman with a bit of maturity. Both characters are orphaned in childhood and face some sort of distress and challenges as a result of that. They both have key relationships that don't run smoothly, shall we say. I'm going to really try and avoid spoilers in this video, so that's as much as I'll say. As characters, they are both kind of those kind of quiet but strong characters that have sort of really enormous underlying passionate strength, but are quite sort of orderly and discreet and almost self-effacing on the surface, so that when their strength of feeling emerges, it almost surprises people. They're both women who determined to support themselves through their own efforts. So, yeah, similarity in characters, and also, again, avoiding spoilers. Both books involve a burning house, Victorian literature trope number 3 or whatever, a burning house, and a male protagonist who is injured in that event, and that kind of changes the power dynamics of the story, or of a key relationship. So that's plot and character. Another similarity, I think, is that both authors have had a really strong Christian faith, we know, and that kind of shows through in their books. But yet, interestingly, they were both seen as books that were really bold and even, kind of immoral initially. A critic writing about Aurora Leigh when it was newly out said that it was occasionally coarse in expression and unfeminine in thought. And Charlotte Bronte had someone, like a kind of a friend really, accuse her to her face of having written a naughty book, and that seems strange to us today, doesn't it? Because the books feel very moral and very sort of, far from shocking. But it does reflect how bold some of the ideas and emotions expressed in the book were at the time. So that's important to bear in mind when we might feel like, oh, they compromise a bit, in terms of what we might like to have seen in terms of, outcomes or endings or views. Now, I don't want to overemphasize the similarities between these two books because, they're very different in style. The storylines are quite, mostly different, with that key burned house injury thing, exception. The range of characters in them. Elizabeth Barrett Browning specifically, although she read Jane Eyre, she specifically rejected the suggestion that she was inspired by Jane Eyre. She may have been slightly underestimating that for herself. We're all influenced, all writers are influenced by things they read, aren't they? So, but that was what she said. But the common thread that I think is really important for me in the two books is the way the two writers, through their characters' actions and through their characters' words, reject some of the constraints that were put on Victorian women, on their lives, on their choices. Jane says that it's narrow-minded to say that they might confine themselves to making puddings and knitting stockings, about women. Aurora describes how Aurora's aunt, who cares for her after she's orphaned, tries to, I love this, flatten and bake Aurora to a wholesome crust for household uses and proprieties. And another point, she specifically says that, she can't and won't just sit and darn. So, yeah, rejecting that kind of idea of what a Victorian woman's life should be. They also, both Jane and Aurora, really, really claim a woman's right to, to pursue their own goals, to be themselves, to be, separate from men, both. Let's give you some quotes. Aurora Leigh describes her aunt as like a caged bird. And, that kind of caged bird life that her aunt epitomizes, is something that she actively rejects. And Jane has an even more famous line about a bird, doesn't she? For many of us, it's our favourite quotation from the novel. She says, "I am no bird and no net ensnares me. I am a free human being with an independent will." Yeah. Interestingly, both Aurora and Jane specifically refused to marry in order to get sort of financial security. That's something that they turned down. Aurora says, "If I married him, I should not dare to call my soul my own, which so he had bought and paid for." And Jane says, "I can live alone if self-respect and circumstances require me to do so. I need not sell my soul to buy bliss." Yeah. And it's when you remember lines like that you realise the boldness of what Charlotte Bronte and Elizabeth Barrett Browning were saying. Again, interestingly, both Aurora and Jane are invited to marry a man, proposed to, in order that he can carry out good works. They're asked to kind of like lose themselves in supporting a man to do good works. And in a sense that epitomizes the Victorian sense of what a woman's duty would be. And as I say, both Charlotte Bronte and Elizabeth Barrett Browning were very sort of, had strong Christian morality. And, you might have expected them to think that that was something that women should be willing to do. But, both Aurora and Jane reject this. It's not that they don't see the value of those good works in it, but they know they wouldn't be themselves if they made that choice. And Jane, in Jane Eyre, is willing to share the work, but only as herself and not as a wife. That's her what she specifies. But Aurora kind of almost takes it a step further, because she's holding out for her right to creative self-expression, to be a poet, and she is arguing that practical good works are important, but so is the life of the mind and an artistic expression and artistic endeavor is also worthwhile. And she feels that it's justified for her to pursue her artistic career aspirations rather than lose herself in a man's sort of plan for doing good. I have to say that it honestly thrills my heart to feel that kind of connection between these characters and these writers, these authors, and me, and what I might sort of aspire to or feel that should be choices for women. And they're not 21st century women. Neither the authors nor the writers. And as a modern woman, we may be a little frustrated when, in some respects, they don't exactly match our modern day expectations, our modern day sort of values. I would say that both writers do seem to show or see marriage as, perhaps the most natural and desirable goal for a woman or outcome in a woman's life. But not, the key thing is not on any terms, not if it will mean that they lose the woman loses their self-respect or their sense of themselves as individual beings with their own ideas, and that both Barrett Browning and Bronte allow their female women protagonists to choose that partnership that is marriage, but not to be totally dependent on it either. Even if it's seen in a sense as kind of completing them and completing their lives, Charlotte Bronte shows Jane able to insist on mutual respect in marriage, and Elizabeth Barrett Browning gives Aurora Leigh an even sort of broader space within a potential marriage. She is clear that Aurora should be able to be both a poet and a wife, and that those two things aren't, mutually contrary, impossible. So, two tremendous books that I love. That's my take on them, but I would love to hear yours if you've read them, either or both. And feel free to disagree or to kind of extend my arguments. That's really welcome.